within Clarence House's silent, guarded walls.
Get back!
Prince Louis, the youngest Wales child, made a startling discovery, not a reporter or a royal insider. His naive curiosity took him to Queen Camilla's secret apartments, which are off-limits to nearly everyone. What he discovered on her nightstand was more than just a memento. For years, it had been a terrible secret. The young prince was moved to tears by the object, which was intimately connected to Princess Diana and his own sister, Princess Charlotte. This caused a quiet firestorm among the royal family. An aspect of the monarchy that you were never supposed to witness is revealed by the truth of what Prince Louis discovered. A door that ought to have remained shut. That afternoon, the palace was silent, not in the tranquil quiet of an empty house, but in the strained stillness that permeates the atmosphere when something is simply wrong. Unbelievably, what was meant to be a low-key family visit took place at Clarence House. Family members and a few assistants were the only people going through the old halls. There were no cameras or public comments. The king was holding a private meeting with Prince William and Princess Catherine, which was already taking longer than expected. Young Prince Louis, who was always intelligent, inquisitive, and frequently underestimated, had been left in the care of a reliable staff member while Princess Charlotte was preoccupied with her music tutor. However, that employee briefly left to answer an important call. It only took that long. Louis had no intention of stirring up trouble. The long, carpeted corridor appeared like an adventure waiting to happen, and he was just bored. He strolled past one closed door, then another, his little shoes making no sound. However, he eventually reached a separate door. It wasn't completely closed. The entire atmosphere of the day would be altered by that door, which was slightly open and released a subtle aroma of lavender combined with a stronger, musky perfume. He had a gut feeling that he shouldn't be in this room. However, the allure of the unknown was too great. He didn't discover anything dramatic or noisy inside. In all honesty, it was quiet. However, the quiet cried out. It was a silent realization that caused his eyes to tear up and his tiny chest to tighten. Some family traumas are spoken in quiet rooms rather than proclaimed from the rooftops. Prince Louis heard them all at once that day. He pushed the hefty wooden door with a worn-out brass handle. With a gentle creak, it opened to reveal a dimly lit interior. The afternoon sun was shaded by thick curtains, creating long, subdued shadows on the floor. Although the space was small, it was packed with the kind of personal belongings that indicate a life lived. Every surface had framed photos, half-burned candles, and silk scarves covering seats. Everything seemed terribly intimate and brittle, as though touching anything would make it fall apart. Louis tiptoed inside and took a cautious step. It seemed like a place that required respect and quiet. He initially noticed a vanity table with dozens of perfume bottles stacked like tiny glass soldiers. He squinted at the expensive labels as he leaned forward. Some had gold trim, while others appeared much older with faded and tattered labels. At that moment, he saw a plain silver picture frame next to them. The picture showed Queen Camilla standing close to a small kid Louis didn't recognize, looking considerably younger. It was merely an ancient, forgotten moment with no name or description. He continued, looking around the room. Near the bed, a jewelry box was partially open, revealing vibrant silk scarves. On the windowsill lay a pair of sophisticated gloves that appeared to have been left there only moments before, despite a small film of dust covering them. However, something else caught his eye. There was a letter, more precisely, an envelope tucked behind a large horse-shaped paperweight. The penmanship was precise, sharp, and unusual, and it was sealed. Prince Louis froze when he saw a single name written in slightly faded writing across the center. Charlotte. He simply stood there, blinking. At first, he just stared at it without touching it. Why was his sister's name written in a hand he had never seen before in this room? Suddenly, the room's silence seemed heavier, as if the air itself was holding its breath. anticipating his arrival. Louis tentatively and slowly extended his hand, his tiny fingertips grazing the sharp edge of the paper. And he was quite confident that something was seriously wrong in that one brief time. He simply had no idea how bad things would get. Not quite yet. However, one thing was certain. This was just the start of a darker, much larger secret. The wooden box's secrets. In his hands, the envelope felt far heavier than a single sheet of paper ought to. The chilly precision with which Charlotte's name was scrawled made Louis's own hands shake, even if he hadn't intended to take it. He tucked it inside his blazer pocket out of sheer bewilderment rather than a desire to get into trouble. He no longer even knew to whom the letter actually belonged. Perhaps it was for Charlotte if her name was on it. Perhaps it was an overlooked surprise. However, there was no sense of joyful surprises in this environment. It had the atmosphere of a secret room. The kind of secrets that envelop themselves in complete silence and the subtle scent of vintage perfume. As he turned to go, the atmosphere in the room changed once more. He had the impression that the room itself, rather than any individual, was keeping an eye on him. It was as though the walls themselves had committed every person who had ever entered the space to memory and knew he wasn't meant to be one of them. Louis turned to face the vanity table again. He noticed his own tiny reflection in the old, slightly cracked mirror, the pale blue of his shirt collar sticking out in the darkness. He nearly returned the envelope to its original location for a brief moment. However, the edge of something else attracted his attention. A tiny wooden box was hidden under the table, almost out of sight. It was a modest, unadorned box with a hinge that had been thoughtlessly left open. Louis crouched and looked inside. He noticed a strange assortment of objects that didn't make sense when combined. A handkerchief was present, beautifully embroidered with the initials SS. There was also an old black-and-white picture of a woman whose smile seemed defiant and melancholy, but he didn't identify her. And there was something he hoped he had never touched in the bottom, tucked under everything else. A ripped page from what appeared to be a journal. He could only see a few lines of text, but it was enough to cause his stomach to knot. The handwriting was cool, precise, and sharp, just like the one on the envelope. Despite being broken, the words were unmistakable. She will never be accepted, unlike her, regardless of what I do. Louis's fingers felt abruptly cold, and he slipped the paper back into the box as if it had burned him. He bolted to his feet, his pulse thumping in his chest for reasons he was unable to articulate. Now the envelope in his pocket felt heavier and darker than before. Even though he no longer desired it, he was unable to let go of it. That space, that box, that terrible note. The discovery was not intended for his eyes. None of them were intended recipients. He heard laughter coming from down the corridor, faintly. Someone, possibly an assistant, had opened a door. The sound served as a sharp reminder that there was still life outside this weird, quiet chamber, that tea was most likely still being served, and that someone would undoubtedly be seeking for him shortly. He needed to leave. But the next thing he found would be even more incriminating. A secret so intimate that it would rock his family's foundation. An image, a recording, and an agonizing reality. The silence of the vehicle trip home felt unsettling. Normally, Louis would bombard the room with inquiries and incomplete accounts of his day. However, the back seat was still that afternoon. His transformation was almost immediately apparent to Princess Catherine. As their vehicle moved away from Clarence's house, she met his gaze in the rearview mirror. His fingers were plucking at the hem of his sleeve nervously as he stared out the window, his head resting on the cool glass. There was a change in him. Something very heavy and silent had taken hold. She didn't ask him questions. Not quite yet. She didn't find him sitting on the edge of his bed until they had returned home safely and his siblings had left for other areas of the house. He hadn't even removed his shoes and was still wearing his fully buttoned blazer. The envelope was in his palm, folded, and now wrinkled from being clutched so firmly. Clear as day, the name was still there. Charlotte. In that deliberate, dark ink, I scrolled. Catherine sat next to him, her presence a silent consolation. At first, she didn't look at the letter. They reached his face. His eyes had a red tint, not from playing outside, but from holding back tears. Her voice was quiet as she grabbed the letter. She didn't inquire as to how he discovered it. She didn't have to. His reply in a whisper, "Her room," was all the proof she required. She looked at the envelope and noted that the seal was intact. It was obvious that it was never intended to be opened. However, there was something about it that seemed too deliberate to dismiss. Louis nodded, and she carefully cracked the seal. The paper within had been somewhat yellowed due to being concealed in a dark place rather than aging. Even though the letter was brief, less than 1 page, each word fell like a piece of ice. It mentioned expectations, legacy, ND, an unidentified person who wasn't suitable for the family's reputation. Although the terminology was ambiguous, the goal was very evident. The letter came from someone inside their own boundaries and had no right to be written, much less concealed. With a small tremble in her own fingers, she folded it back up and embraced her son. William would need to see the letter. William read it that evening after Louis had finally gone to sleep. Something inside of him shut down, but his countenance remained composed. He didn't think about how Louis had discovered it. Rather, he was curious what else was in that room. Catherine filled him in on everything. The box is made of wood. The journal page was ripped. He went back to Clarence's house by himself the following morning. He moved purposefully down the hallway, located the door Louis had mentioned, and entered. The last piece of the puzzle was there, partially concealed behind a vase. A picture of Princess Diana, his mother. Her face was split in half by a clean crack in the middle of the frame. And the words were written in a resentful, bitter hand on the glass. Even broken, she still takes up space. However, the terror didn't end there. A discreet housekeeper who was devoted to William eventually disclosed one additional secret. In a storage closet, there was a tiny cassette player. It had a recording of Camilla in whispers. She reportedly bemoaned being in Diana's shadow all the time in the tape, and expressed a terrifying dread that Charlotte, with her elegance and tenderness, will be loved in the same manner as Diana, leaving Camilla to be the shade once more. William now saw the whole image. This was more than a basic resentment. The wound was deep and festering, and in the midst of it, his own son had slipped. William bided his time till the kids were asleep. At last, Louis had calmed down, breathing evenly and calmly. After seeing them from the doorway for a while, Catherine turned to William and nodded slightly, solemnly. Time had come. The nighttime crew moved with a quiet, practiced caution as William arrived at Clarence's house. He was coming, and word had gotten out. They knew enough to avoid being seen, even if they had no idea why. In the library, he discovered Camilla. With a teacup in one hand and a book she wasn't reading in the other, she looked up as he walked in. No smiles were shared. Unspoken accusations filled the room as he softly shut the door behind him. Before they ever exchanged a word, the weight of what he knew filled the void between them. A silent tragedy of bitterness and suffering concealed behind royal walls was revealed by what began with a child's curiosity. What can never be corrected is the true question, not what was discovered. When an apology is never offered, can a family really move on? Please share your opinions in the comments section below if this tale got you thinking. Remember to subscribe for more fascinating royal tales, undiscovered history, and the moments that go unreported behind palace walls.